Welcome, friends. Good afternoon. My name's Bridget Moix. I'm General Secretary of Friends Committee on National Legislation. And I'm here with our lead lobbyist on Middle East issues, Hassan El-Tayyab. Hassan, it's great to be on the screen with you again and see some of those photos from our trip. We are really glad to be able to share this special briefing with you today to convey some of the trip that we came back from in January for 2 weeks in the Middle East. We spent time in an amazing and powerful trip, and we want to share some with you about what we learned, some of the key takeaways, and where we go next on the Middle East. So I want to first, though, say welcome. People are still gathering into our room and our space together. And to say an enormous thank you to everyone for being here and taking time to be with us and share and listen to us. We have, it looks like, over 250 people already joining. So we have a very large group this afternoon. I see folks waving, I see familiar faces. And we're such a large group that we're going to ask you to use the chat box today. When you have questions, we will have time for questions at the end. And as Stephen is noting in the chat box, we will be recording this and we'll be able to share it later. So thank you all so much for joining this afternoon. Before we dive into sharing about the trip, the first and most important thing I want to say right away is thank you. This trip would not have been possible without the support of FCNL donors and supporters and advocates like all of you. And Hassan and I think, agree, and you will hear how important and powerful this trip was for us and what it means in informing our lobbying and advocacy going forward. So thank you so much to everyone who is an ongoing supporter, our monthly sustainers, our planned giving donors, our donors of all kinds, and including people who stepped up when we asked for extra support to make this trip possible. So thank you, thank you, thank you. So with that, I want to turn to the presentation that we have, and thank you. Wesley is our tech person today, and he's bringing up a presentation. We're really grateful for the support he and other staff on the communications team have offered in putting this together. And we're going to go through a little bit of the background of this trip, what it was, what we did, why we went. And then we really want to spend the bulk of our time, Hassan and I will talk together about key takeaways, key lessons, and where we go and what we do next. So Wesley, I can see, is working on the presentation. I can start by giving a little bit of the background. There we go, which is that this trip was organized by a coalition that FCNL is part of called Churches for Middle East Peace. And it was actually organized prior to the events of October 7th. It was planned earlier on as an educational visit for different board members and executive leaders of CNUP, Churches for Middle East Peace, which is a coalition of 30+ church communions. And we've worked with them for a long time. And they educate, elevate, and advocate on a wide range of issues related to the Middle East. But obviously, with the events of October 7th, then it became even more important for us to go on this trip and be part of it. Go ahead to the next slide. So where did we go? What was this trip? We really saw it as a peace delegation once we realized that we were going to be going in the context of the unfolding events and the continued bombardment in Gaza. And we went to flew into Tel Aviv. We were in Israel, Jerusalem for a while. We went to Bethlehem. We went to Ramallah. And then I went with some of the delegation over to up to Beirut, Lebanon, and then over to Amman, Jordan as well. And Hassan spent extra time in Ramallah and the West Bank, which we'll talk about. Why did we do this? As I said, obviously, it felt really important. It also built on previous work and a previous trip that Hassan had taken more than a year ago. And we felt it was very important, as FCNL has been co-leading the ceasefire, National Ceasefire Coalition, and as the situation has been unfolding in Israel and Palestine, we really wanted to listen and learn. We discovered it was a trip of active solidarity was the term that people said to us there, that they really appreciated that we were there in active solidarity with them. And we felt it was really important to be present and to witness what was happening, gather that information and bring it back, to bring that information into our lobbying and advocacy, the stories, and also that information that isn't really reaching policymakers and the public here in the US. What did we do on this trip? Well, it was a lot about relationships. There were a lot of meetings. CMEP, Churches for Middle East Peace, is very well connected with religious leaders, with political leaders, with communities there. And so we met a lot with different groups, particularly the Christian community, but many others as well. And in every meeting, we brought our own advocacy asks around a ceasefire, around humanitarian aid, around addressing the root causes of this conflict into those meetings. We also were there in prayer. We were there and actually held a prayer service that we live streamed and had people join from around the world. And we discovered as the trip unfolded that we were taking information from one meeting into the next in a way that was a little bit like shuttle diplomacy in the moment, in a really critical moment in this conflict as things were unfolding. As I said, we met with a lot of different people in the region. We started talking about princes, prime ministers, presidents, pastors, patriarchs, and peace builders were just some of the folks that we met with. And these ranged from the Prime Minister and President of the Palestinian Authority to US ambassadors in Amman and Israel, to civil society leaders, Israeli human rights leaders, Palestinian civil society leaders, church leaders in all the places we went. And one of the things that we were able to contribute to this delegation was to introduce them all to some of the Quaker work in the region as well. So we invited the delegation after speaking with colleagues at the Ramallah Friends School and at the American Friends Service Committee's office in Amman. We invited the delegation to see some of the Quaker presence in the region, and that was really important, and we spent time there with our colleagues. I'll turn it over to Hassan now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bridget. And thank you to this entire network that made our trip possible. This was an experience that I know Bridget and I will never forget. And the impact of it is so meaningful. And it really meant a lot to the folks that we met with. I wanted to zoom in a little bit on the time at the Ramallah Friends School. That to me was one of the most impactful moments of the trip. I spent about 4 days there. It was a follow-up from a April-May 2022 trip that I had taken. And I was surprised some of the students actually recognized me from that. And I was able to have that conversation back in 2022 and now in 2024 after the war. And it was the amount of trauma that we experienced, that we saw that the kids were experiencing was really overwhelming. Several children cried to us personally, cried in front of their whole classes and assemblies, and just really brought home the devastation of this war and why we need a ceasefire to permanently end this violence. And children at the school repeatedly asked us why the United States was continuing to see this Israeli offensive in Gaza by sending bombs, military assistance, economic support, and diplomatic leverage. Through tears, the third grade cousin of the Ramallah Friends School graduate who remains paralyzed after being shot in a November hate crime in Vermont, he got up in front of his class during this assembly and he says, "Can you tell people in the US to stop supporting crimes of hate against Palestinians?" And it just broke my heart. It really did. His teacher gave him a big hug. And it just brought home the importance of, again, ending the violence, getting humanitarian access, getting the ceasefire, and trying to end U.S. complicity in this horrific conflict that's stretched out over the past 4.5 months, but really we know has been going on for decades. So with that, we'd love to turn to a video. I took a bunch of videos of several students explaining why they wanted a ceasefire and what their hopes and dreams for the future are. And really, I had a whole script before these presentations, and at a certain point I said, what can I really say to these folks that have been under duress for so long? It's time for us to listen so we can present this video to you and hear directly from these Ramallah Friends School kids.
At home, I hope for a ceasefire in Gaza because there are children that are hungry, without a home, that are just like me. They deserve to live in peace with their families and go to school and live safely and healthy.
Over 30,000 people have been killed in Gaza, and over half of them are children. Some had dreams, maybe like mine.
Half of the population of Gaza are children. 1 million children in Gaza. So that is why I support a ceasefire for the children.
As a Palestinian student, seeing all these lifeless bodies of students and children carried out of rubble of their homes that they were just trying to shelter in, brings me sadness. I'm so grateful that I still have a mother. I still have clean water. I still have food to eat. I still have a home, because these children in Gaza, they don't have any of that.
My hopes and dreams for the future are just like the children in Gaza and the children around the world. To live safely, happily, freely, and we should grow up to be able to contribute to the world.
That Palestine will be a free country so that all the Palestinians will have the freedom of going wherever they want, feeling like it's their country.
To live freely. I want justice. I want the occupation to end.
That Palestine will be free, and I will be able to represent my country, Palestine, in the horseback riding Olympics.
Thank you so much. Really powerful testimony. And with that, I'd like us to go into some of the key takeaways from what we learned on this trip. 6 to be exact. And Bridget, I can pass it to you so you can start us off.
Great, sure, thank you. Watching those kids reminds me of that first night in the school, Hassan, and the experience of hearing the gunfire and hearing jets overhead at night. And then the next day, the students and the faculty telling us that was just daily life there, since October 7th, that had been ongoing every day. And one of the most important lessons and takeaways that we heard everywhere we went, and that was underlined by that experience, was that the call for an immediate and permanent ceasefire is the most important thing we can be asking for right now, that we have to keep up that as the primary ask, and that is not just a ceasefire to save people in Gaza. That is a ceasefire to save the hostages and get them back. It's a ceasefire to help prevent the further escalation of this conflict in the region. It's a ceasefire to ensure that humanitarian aid can get in and meet the enormous needs that are there. So the ceasefire ask that we have been doing since October 8th, actually lobbying on since October 8th, was really important. And in many of the meetings, we shared that over 500,000 letters to Congress urging a ceasefire have been sent through FCNL's website. And it was very encouraging to people to hear that. They were grateful for the advocacy that we're doing, and we need to keep that up. So that was takeaway number 1. Hassan, do you want to add anything and then go to the next one?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Lena, a 6th grade Palestinian student at the Ramallah Friends School, passed us a note. She left it in the main office after one of the assemblies, and it's a really gorgeous note, but just for the sake of this conversation, she said, a child is dying in Gaza every 5 minutes. Gaza needs a break. The Palestinian people are desperate for a ceasefire, which will allow them to get supplies like food, water, medical kits. And again, that was echoed across the board. And that's the answer. FCNL has been calling for the ceasefire since on October 8th, we put out our statement. And we know that more war is not the answer. And we need that ceasefire to protect Israelis and Palestinians, ensure the safe return of hostages, and finally address the humanitarian crisis that's exploding in Gaza. And then we can go to our second takeaway, which is diplomacy is needed to de-escalate the Middle East. And for months, the Biden administration has said that its goal is to prevent this regional escalation. But it was clear from our trip that the regional war is already here and getting worse by the day. While we were in the occupied West Bank, we actually made the decision not to fly to Erbil, Iraq, due to IRGC or Iranian Revolutionary Guard airstrikes next to the consulate close to where we were going to stay. We learned that the United States had struck targets against the Houthis in Yemen while we were at dinner with faith leaders in Bethlehem. Israel and Lebanese armed group Hezbollah continue to trade strikes at the Lebanon-Israel border. There's a mounting death toll there. Settler violence and Israeli military raids are escalating across the West Bank. While I was in Jerusalem, I actually heard air raid sirens shriek through the desolate old city, which was devoid of tourism. In 2022, I was there during Ramadan. It was so full of life, bustling with shops, with tourists, with people of faith going to their places of worship. And what we saw there this trip was really a city that had been hollowed out. And it was just something that I will never forget, just how quiet it was after being so loud. And we also heard the stories directly from people on the Israeli side and the Lebanese side that had been displaced from their homes. Hundreds of thousands of people have had to evacuate. Several days after we flew out of Amman, a drone attack killed 3 U.S. service members in Jordan, and a tragedy that President Biden has said that he needs to respond to with force. And our message is clear that these are all directly connected to the war in Gaza and will continue unless there's a ceasefire and robust regional dialogue. And Bridget, I can pass it back to you.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I'll just tell one more story maybe about that the feeling of that widening war. When the delegation went to Beirut, we landed and had our first meeting in a building somewhere in the city. And we were navigating the streets and trying to find this meeting, walking along a street. And someone literally flagged us down and said, "Are you from Churches for Middle East Peace?" Which we sort of looked around and said, how in the world did these folks know we were here? But they had been following us. It was a Mennonite Central Committee worker who is based there in Beirut and is working with communities along the southern Lebanon, the southern border of Lebanon. And she came up to us and she said, I want to tell you about the white phosphorus that has burned down all of the greenhouses that we have built in these communities over the past year. The white phosphorus from the bombs has now destroyed all of that work, and the communities are being displaced repeated times. And that was escalating just as we were there. I did have the chance to say, have you talked to your members of Congress about this? And she said, yes, I have actually spoken to my House member. And so we were talking about how we can lobby more on that and bring that information in. But that feeling of the escalation and expansion really followed us throughout the trip and made that last leg of the trip. We were supposed to go to Erbil, Iraq, for the last leg of the trip, and made that impossible because of the bombings that happened there, and we had to cancel that. So let's go on to the next takeaway. This is obviously people have seen and heard a lot about the humanitarian situation, and the issues of access for humanitarian aid are deeply, deeply troubling. It is not just the volume of aid that is needed at this point in Gaza. on a situation where enormous aid was already needed before, but it is a mountain of obstacles to try to get any aid through. So one of the numbers that has really stuck with me is that prior to October 7th, so before all of this recent bombing, there were 500 trucks, humanitarian aid trucks a day needed to meet humanitarian needs in Gaza. 500 trucks a day. When the attacks of October 7th happened, the Israeli government said that it was going to shut down all aid, electricity, water, everything. The US government managed to negotiate. It's a good thing that they negotiated a little bit because they got that up to 100 trucks. But that's a cap right now, a cap of how many trucks can get in. And most days, that number of trucks is not getting in. I just heard now the UN is saying that 7,000 trucks a day is what is going to be needed to actually meet the humanitarian need in Gaza. And in the meantime, we heard stories from colleagues at American Friends Service Committee and other aid groups that the obstacles for getting the needed aid in are enormous. It's scanning that the Israeli government is now requiring of every truck, where trucks have to go from one entry point to another, get scanned, go back. And if any single item is found to not comply or be problematic, then the whole truck is turned around. So there are a lot of issues with humanitarian aid and access. And of course, now we have the added problem that UNRWA's funding is being halted by the US and other European governments because of the allegations of some UNRWA workers being involved in Hamas. And we just met with the head of UNRWA here in DC yesterday and heard more about that. We can talk more about it, but it is extremely problematic. People's needs cannot be met in Gaza without UNRWA. It's just a life-saving part of the realities in Gaza. And Hassan, I know you have a story from being with some UNRWA workers that I wonder if you want to share.
Yeah, thank you. And I echo everything Bridget just said. Humanitarian access is a lifeline for people right now in Gaza and the West Bank. I actually caught a shuttle with an UNRWA worker through the Al-Lembi Bridge into Jordan on my last day. During the ride, this UNRWA employee was sitting next to me. Her name was Nisreen, and told me about her work in off hours to evacuate Gazan children in critical condition for emergency medical treatment. She showed me pictures of the kids, severe burns, amputated limbs, and these were disturbing images that I will never forget. You know, we are seeing these images on Twitter, on, Al Jazeera, but this is someone that she knew each of these families personally and had been working to get them out. And she's been able to save more than 50 children with her colleagues, getting them safe passage into Egypt, Turkey, Qatar, Jordan, Oman, and elsewhere, all accompanied by a +1 adult and their siblings. And despite her being able to secure medical evacuations to a hospital in Florida, she explained that many of the families refuse to get treated in the United States out of fear. We tell them that there are very good doctors and medical facilities, but they're too scared to go to the United States, Nisreen told us. And I praised her for her passion, and she let me know that I'm doing it not to surrender to the fact that there is no justice. And that just broke my heart to think that there are children in Gaza with third degree burns, over 60% of their bodies, with amputated limbs, without anesthesia, that are choosing to stay in Gaza because they're afraid to go to the United States. And that's what this war is doing. It's just, to say it's damaging US credibility on the world stage is an understatement. And we have a lot of work to do. And what Bridget was mentioning about UNRWA is critical. 12 of the 13,000 UNRWA staff in the territory are being punished for the actions of 12. And despite UNRWA firing the individuals, opening up an investigation, the U.S. has completely paused funding to the agency. And in the Senate supplemental that just passed, there was a provision prohibiting UNRWA from being funded. And without these funds, Nisreen and other heroic UNRWA staff won't be able to serve Palestinians facing the world's worst hunger crisis. And it's time for the U.S. to restore this funding and use leverage with Israel to increase humanitarian access. And with that, we can go to the next takeaway, which is urgent steps to end mass atrocities are needed. And as we arrived in Israel, the ICJ, or International Court of Justice, was just opening up South Africa's case against Israel, invoking the Genocide Convention. And the world was watching. And on our first evening, we met an Israeli human rights leader that said that we were already more informed about the atrocities happening in Gaza because a lot of folks in Israel just were not getting the message. It's not being reported in the mainstream media, and there's really a bubble around the information. We really believe that it's time for the U.S. to live up to what the ICJ measures are, which says that we need to prevent genocide, we need to punish incitement, and we need to ensure humanitarian aid access for people that really need the support right now. And I can pass it to Bridget to say a bit more.
Yeah, thanks. So this is a really important one for me because I do have background. Some folks know I worked on prevention of genocide and mass atrocities for a number of years, both with FCNL and our advocacy around that, but also in the administration at USAID, U.S. Agency for International Development. I was an atrocity prevention fellow for a few years. And during that time, we actually wrote the book. We developed a training for U.S. officials in other places in the world who might see signs of mass atrocities or genocide. What would those signs be? How to respond? And so as we were traveling around and meeting people, hearing what was happening, hearing the levels of dehumanization, hearing the humiliation and trauma in Israel and how that is driving decision-making, hearing the trauma and suffering in Gaza and in Palestinian areas, and hearing the regional situation, and seeing all the measures that were taking place, including distribution of weapons to settlers, which we know is happening, blocking of roads so that different communities are cut off from one another. All the warning signs were going off in my head, and it was very concerning. And then we had, just as we landed, as Hassan said, this ruling from the International Court of Justice. And that whole process, it was televised. We did not see it much here in the US. We don't hear much about it now, but that was a critical moment. And for people there, it was a really important, for Palestinians especially, it was a really important moment to say the international community has recognized there is a severe risk and there are ongoing atrocities, and they need to be prevented and actions need to be taken. So that was definitely a takeaway that I have come back with, and was just meeting with other members from the delegation, with State Department officials this week, and talking more about that, and asking what measures within the US's own toolkit for preventing mass atrocities were being taken. And critically, to go to the next takeaway, the issue of US complicity as well. So I'll turn it, yeah, there we go, thanks. So just to start this, and then I'll let Hassan add more. As I said, in the first night in Ramallah, listening to warplanes go over at night, I couldn't help but lie there and think about the fact that they could well have US bombs on them that would be dropped on Gaza and kill children, innocent civilians the next day. And the weight of complicity was something that I felt us carrying throughout the delegation. People were very appreciative that we were there as Americans with a different message, that we were there saying we want our government to end its complicity in the violence, We want our government to be complicit in peace for this region, not in ongoing war and violence. And while we were there, the Senate actually took the first historic vote on centering Palestinian rights and addressing a human rights review of US military aid to Israel. Now, that vote failed, as we knew it would, but the point was we forced the Senate to have a debate and to look at US military aid to Israel for the first time. And I'll turn it back to Hassan to say more, because he did a huge amount of work to make that vote happen.
Thank you so much. You know, that vote, it put into perspective what is felt on the other side of the world. And when the Senate actually, you know, letters matter, resolutions matter, but when they bring something to the floor, that's something that people pay attention to, and we're witnessing. And I was just impressed at how tuned in to U.S. politics and U.S. activism and the activism of our entire community folks in Palestine were, and folks in Israel were, specifically the human rights activists that we kept meeting with at Yesh Din, Gisha, and Hamoked, and Breaking the Silence. I'll also say that was the most militarized place I've ever been. And I know Bridget has a lot of experience, but for me, I had never been in an environment like that. The West Bank was filled with checkpoints, soldiers everywhere. Israeli civilians were walking around with AR-15s, hands, finger on the trigger in front of holy sites all over the old city, and you could just cut the tension with a knife. We were at a loss of words trying to explain our government's actions with everyone we met. On the Palestinian and Israeli human rights side, especially the children. And it was very humbling that some of the Ramallah Friends School students, after one of the assemblies I did, thanked FCNL for our advocacy. And I was so grateful for that, but I came back just knowing that we can't stop our advocating for a ceasefire and our work to end US complicity. And with that, we can maybe go to the next slide and talk about hope for the way forward and hopefully lasting peace. That's me strumming the sixth string at the Ramallah Friends School. I didn't realize that was going to be the photo, but that's fun. So I spent many hours with the students at the Ramallah Friends School, and also the Carter Center's Israel-Palestine team. They are doing just incredible intra-Palestinian dialogue work, talking to all the activists, civil society, talking to political leaders, the Fatah Central Committee. I mean, it was just fascinating for me to drop in on all of this work that's going on. A couple key takeaways from that is one meeting we had with ISEP, or the Institute for Social and Economic Progress. They did a bunch of post-October 7 polling of folks in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. They found some data points I think we should know about that challenge mainstream assumptions. One is that support for a two-state solution is now at 57%, a 20-point jump since before October 7. So we're seeing more support for an independent Palestinian state. We also saw that 75% of Palestinians wanted a democracy with freedom of religion. 56% want elections after the war. And if there were an election, Marwan Barghouti, the imprisoned Fatah-aligned Intifada leader, would actually beat Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar with 66% of the vote. And many have referred to Marwan Barghouti as the Nelson Mandela of Palestine. Later on in the trip, I actually met with Marwan Barghouti's wife, Fadwa, who's renewing the international campaign to secure his release and the release of all political prisoners on the Palestinian side. She told me, as a wife, I'd miss him. but if he's released to Gaza to help Palestine, I support it. And that just really stuck out to me. And also the fact that there was no campaign in the U.S. to free him. I was surprised at how little was being done on that. So that's one potential area of advocacy just to explore that we're discussing now. And on the day that I met Fadwa, a film called Tomorrow's Freedom was actually released on Apple TV. And we are going to be doing a film screening on March 14th at Friends Place, and it might be a hybrid event. Later that week, I joined the Carter Center staff at a Fatah conference where leaders of the Central Committee spoke of their vision of the party's future, and the public was able to express opinions and ask questions. Many called for Mahmoud Abbas to step down and for the one-man show and authoritarian rule to end. In addition to the devastating toll of the war, on Palestinian society, it was clear from so many of our conversations with Israelis and Israeli human rights activists that they are still reeling from the atrocious massacre of October 7 and anxiously awaiting for the return of more than 100 hostages still being held in Gaza. And in many ways, I was surprised the U.S. government really supports and amplifies a lot of the voices from the more extreme right-wing segments of Israeli society, while failing to emphasize some of the voices of a mass segment of the Israeli population that are calling for an agreement. They want a ceasefire, and they want to bring the hostages home, and they want to stop IDF soldiers from being put in harm's way in Gaza. Those are their friends, their family, and they want to see an end to it. And this week, I was so blown away. Gisha, an Israeli human rights organization, put together the largest coalition calling for a ceasefire so far since the start of the war. They have 40 plus organizations. And so you see this surge of support. I'm not going to say that it's a majority or even close to that right now, but the left wing and the folks calling for negotiations and an end to the conflict is growing by the day. And I can pass it back to Bridget.
Thanks, Hassan. I think we were both really impressed and humbled, was a word you used earlier, by the remarkable resilience and commitment of people in Israel, in Palestinian areas, in Lebanon, in Jordan, who are committed to finding a way forward and to building a peaceful future, even in the midst of all of this. So it was very inspiring. We want to say a word about what's next and what you can do, but I want to actually take a breath, because we've been saying a lot and it's heavy, and it helps to take a pause. Thank you for that. It's helpful for me. So what we're doing now and what you can do, as you heard a little bit already, we are already taking what we learned, what we heard, the voices and lessons from this trip into our lobbying and our advocacy. Churches for Middle East Peace already had a lobby day yesterday. I think it was 2 days ago. It was this week. Hassan was with delegations on the Hill. I was in the administration with some delegations and then back on the Hill. So really already we are using what we've learned in the lobbying advocacy. And I want to ask Hassan to tell us what we can do, what we can all do next for the advocacy and lobbying work.
Thank you so much. That's absolutely right. With this trip, a lot of staffers want to know what we experienced, and that's a real value to our advocacy and lobbying work. But number one, we heard from Palestinians and Israelis that our advocacy is giving them hope. That is what they're, that's what they want to see. And it was very inspiring and humbling. And they're following what we're doing, and it really matters. Your advocacy matters. The fact that FCNL has already sent over 500,000 letters to Congress matters. And they, and the success that we've had getting 67 members calling for publicly calling for a ceasefire matters. The first ever 502B vote in Senate history matters. And the coalition that we've helped build, at the national level, states and districts around the country really matters. So what are we doing? Number one, getting public statements from members of Congress is the top priority right now. We want to take that 67, we want to get over 100. We need to keep that going. We need humanitarian aid and more members on the record calling for humanitarian assistance, access, and really, not getting into the details, but so many of those dual use issues and the inspection regime, that really needs an overhaul, and we need to expedite assistance and restore funding to UNRWA. And last but definitely not least, we have to end U.S. complicity. A lot of folks have been working on Senator Van Hollen's amendment to the supplemental, which turned into a national security memorandum from the Biden administration. We need to follow up on that. Senator Sanders has indicated he wants to bring back the 502B resolution later on. And because the situation is escalating, we're asking folks to take higher level actions. And I know everyone here, 365 people, you have done so much already, and we need to keep going. Right now, in the ceasefire toolkit, which we'll drop in the chat, in there, we want folks to make a phone call. You've already done emails, and a lot of you maybe have already done phone calls, but we have a script in there, and we'd love for people to take that higher level action. Also drop-bys, and we have a new LTE script for folks that we'd love for people to get an LTE published and calling out their senators and their representative by name in that, so they really get the message. Yes, letter to the editor is an LTE. and with that, and I'm so grateful for all of the work that this community has already done, and we need to keep going. And Bridget, I can pass it to you.
Thank you, Hassan. Yes, we cannot do our advocacy without all your voices, and we cannot do it without financial support. So the other thing we really are asking is for your continued support to help us do this work. We have brought in many, many new people to our network because of this work on a ceasefire. It's really remarkable. We're at a point where we can engage many, many new people. And we need continued and increased financial support to be able to do that. So I know that Stephen, he's already done it. We'll drop a link into the chat if you feel led to donate now. If you feel led to contact him to make a special gift, please do. I know he'll be happy to talk to you, as would any of us. And thank you again for how you help us do our work. We cannot do this without you. And just again, as I began, thank you so much. So we'll take a pause again and turn to, I believe Stephen has been collecting a few questions for us. Is that right, Stephen? Are we ready for that?
Yes, we are ready. Can you hear me? Okay, great. So the first question is from Fairuz Azer, and they ask, any hope that the US will join Canada, Australia, and New Zealand to ask for a ceasefire and stop Israeli attacking Rafah?
Very important question. So I think in the short term, unfortunately, I think it's going to be difficult. What the administration has said that they want is to get a humanitarian pause. They've opposed the invasion of Rafah and the offensive there. But really, we need to increase the pressure and the support on Capitol Hill to give political space to call for that ceasefire. So our advocacy is really connected to that result. I've also heard that Algeria is about to put forth a UN Security Council resolution that's going to get voted on. And I believe, I haven't seen text yet, but I believe they're discussing putting something in there about the offensive in Rafah. And that's going to increase pressure as well to call for the ceasefire, stop the assault on Rafah, and try to hopefully resolve the crisis. But really, at this point, our advocacy is what's driving the conversation and making it possible for there to be a ceasefire. And we have to, obviously, what's happening in Rafah is just devastating. It's been a very hard week for all of us and everyone that loves peace and seeing this unfold. But we can't stop now. We have to really keep pushing, keep pressing our members, making the phone calls, writing the emails, taking the lobby visits. And this is just such an urgent time. And I can pass it to Bridget if she has more to say.
Well, I would just say that Rafah really featured in the meetings we had with the State Department just this week. And it feels like this breaking point. Honestly, it just, even folks in the State Department were saying, Rafah is staring us in the face at like what's going to happen next. And we know that President Biden has, his rhetoric has shifted some. He started saying, you really need to protect civilians. It's not happening. And so at what point does the US say, okay, we need to use the most important leverage we have, which is military aid, and start restricting it more? But Rafah, is on everyone's hearts and minds. And it's a really difficult situation right now.
So Roman asks, and others do as well, about the two-state solution. Is that still a possibility? What steps might be needed to get to that? Are there other options?
I can start here. So this is incredibly difficult right now, despite the fact that, yes, we have more and more Palestinians wanting the two-state solution, according to that ISEP poll. Prime Minister Netanyahu said he does not want a two-state solution. In fact, they want to have security enforced by Israel across the entire region: West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza, Israel, 48. And that is incredibly difficult to overcome because we ultimately need an agreement. But FCNL has kind of shifted our approach. While we still support a two-state solution, ultimately we have a human rights framing, and we need to make sure that US weapons aren't being used to abuse Palestinian human rights. We need to get the ceasefire, humanitarian access as a starting point for hopefully an expanded dialogue that is supported by the international community to actually get sustainable peace. So laser focused on ceasefire to open up other possibilities for diplomacy to hopefully address the root causes, which are the occupation, the blockade, access to Al-Aqsa, the settler attacks, settler violence, settlement activity. And so, and going across the West Bank, it's really, I gotta say, it's really hard to see how this is even possible right now when you've got all this infrastructure from settlers just across the region, like near Nablus. From the playground at the Ramallah Friends School, you can see settlements all over the horizon. And so many have called for a one-state solution. Many have called for a confederation, like a loose kind of affiliation of states that live side by side. But ultimately, we need basic equality and human rights as a guiding principle.
Yeah, I'll just add something that I didn't mention earlier, but was really part of the experience that was quite humbling in the whole trip, was that the long presence and work of Quakers on peace in the region really came through in this trip. We were asked, we would show up and they'd say, oh, the Quakers, they're back again. Here they are, here you are. We were asked, where are the Quakers? It was very humbling to be in that context. And before I left, I was rereading some of the previous work that Quakers have done, including a book which many people here might know called When the Rain Returns, which is around 20 years old at this point, but it was from a Quaker delegation that went to the region and listened exactly for an answer to that question. Is a two-state solution possible? What would it look like? How could it work? And even at that time, the conclusion was, it still seems like the best possibility, but it's really hard to see how it would work. I think that what Quakers have always done and what we need to continue doing is to listen to the people in the region and let them decide what is the way forward with those principles, as Hassan said, those principles of equality for all, dignity of all, security and safety for all, with those principles as what we uphold, and then let them decide what shape does that take and what will it look like.
Kathy and John Gourlay ask, can individual U.S. citizens donate to UNRWA U.S. now, and will the money go to Gaza?
Absolutely. Actually, I'm doing a fundraiser tonight for UNRWA USA at Busboys and Poets on K Street. Folks can make a donation to UNRWA USA. That's a great use of funds, and they can also make a direct donation to the UN agency as well. But know that UNRWA USA, they're doing incredible work. So empowering them, they fundraised $24+ million last year. So that's a great organization to support, who can then do more of that, organizing and fundraising in North America. So yes, both of those organizations are a fantastic place to put your money. As far as it getting into Gaza right now, yes, it can, although the humanitarian access issue still needs to be resolved for them to get, the at least 500 trucks a day, if not the 7,000 that are actually needed to address this unfolding humanitarian crisis where hundreds of thousands of people literally are on the brink of famine right now.
Martha Turner asks, could you address collective trauma in both the Israeli and Palestinian communities?
I'll let Bridget do that.
Well, I'll start. I think, as I said, it really felt, you could feel how the trauma was everywhere, how it was driving people's experiences, how it was driving the responses. And the analogy that kept coming to me, and that, I would say I felt personally, this was 9/11 for Israel. October 7th was 9/11 for Israel. And that level of collective trauma, we saw the same mistakes. We are seeing the same kind of mistakes that the US made, which was thinking that the right response to that trauma is more violence. And the trauma on the Palestinian side goes back, a long time, and it's just deepened by this crisis. And one of the things that the faculty at Ramallah Friends School said to us was, we're a Quaker school. We are committed to teaching nonviolence, to teaching dignity for all, to teaching love thy neighbor. It's really hard right now. It's really hard to hold the space and teach that, because the level of violence and collective trauma is so expansive and so deep at the time. And so it really felt like what's happening now, it's going to shape the next generations. It's going to shape what happens in the region. It's going to shape what happens in the US and what it means for the US reputation and response, and sort of being in the region and even being here. And we need to try to help shift towards a healing approach rather than, a violent response. And we need to support the work of the way forward, ceasefire to end the violence, interrupt the trauma, and then work towards a positive ceasefire, a positive lasting solution.
Can I tack on to that? And I think when I hear that question, it just takes me right back to how many children at the Ramallah Friends School cried over what's happening in front of me, in front of Bridget, in front of their whole class, and these different assemblies. I had one girl raise her hand. She's a 5th grader. She said, "Why is Israel lying to their kids about us?" And she said, "They don't even think we're a country." And she broke down in tears. Her teacher escorted her out of the room. She was out of the room for about 15, 20 minutes. She was consoling her. Another student at the same classroom raised her hand and said, I was just held up at gunpoint at a checkpoint. an Israeli soldier put a gun, in front of her, and then upset her mother. The mother started crying. And that story, after that discussion, none of the teachers even knew about it. It was just day-to-day reality for folks. And that circulated around the schools. Everybody heard about this young girl's story. I already told you about the Ramallah, friend student that was in 3rd grade related to the Ramallah grad who was paralyzed. And just so many of these children are just holding this trauma. And last thing I'll just say is, in 2022, I met a little girl. She was in 6th grade, and she's raised her hand and said, I know I'm going to get bullied for this, but I support peace with Israel. Her classmate raises her hand and says, I'm not going to bully her. I just don't think it's possible. And 2 years later, that same girl raises her hand during an assembly. She's now in 8th grade and says, why is the U.S. complicit in a genocide against Israeli genocide against Gaza? That was her words. And it was just so sad to see kind of the hope and, this little peace activist basically hardening and seeing that the doors of peace are slamming shut. And, that's the real risk. If we continue this until we get that permanent ceasefire, we're going to see another generation that's completely traumatized. And Bridget already mentioned the how much people are reeling from the October 7 attacks, and how right as soon as you get out off the plane in the airport, you're seeing signs of bring our hostages home. So these are deeply traumatized peoples, and the only thing that we need right now is that ceasefire.
I just want to add, Stephen, it's probably time for one more question, but I want to add, I know people are sharing some good resources in the chat, and this is called Glimmers of Hope. And so what was the hope for getting through this trauma and shifting things that we saw? 2 things I would say. One is, what helps people process trauma? It's being able to speak it and process it with people and rehumanize themselves and others. And in the Ramallah Friends School, one of the things they did with the students after October 7th is they had solidarity stands. They had a place where any student could come up and speak to other students, to the community, about what they were feeling, what they were going through, what they wanted to say. And those, they said, had been very important for their own processing. On the Israeli side, when we arrived, the Israeli human rights activists that we met with in our first meeting said, there's no space right now. We said, how much space is there for people who want, a different way forward? She said, there's really not any space. By the end of our trip, there was the largest peace demonstration in Tel Aviv that had happened yet to that date. So people are helping open up that space, and we can be part of that. Stephen, do you have one more question?
Yes. What does everybody leaving this call, what do they do right now?
Go to the ceasefire toolkit, and there are 3 easy steps in there. Making that phone call, doing the drop by, and doing that LTE. Those are 3 critical steps. It's all laid out very clearly in the ceasefire toolkit. We can share that again. And just so grateful to folks here for all of the advocacy so far. I mean, over 500,000 emails to Congress already. And every week I see another 8,000, 10,000, just keeps going and going. And am I wrong? Is that an FCNL record? Have we ever? Yes. Okay. We've never done that before as a community. So thank you.
And number 2, you can donate and support us to continue this work. And Stephen can put that link in the chat too. And thank you so much for being part of our advocacy and supporting everything that we do with all of your support.